COVID-related deaths have passed the 1 million mark, and President Biden has ordered flags to fly at half-staff to remember this milestone in his administration, as problems continue to add up across the country in fighting what some are calling a never-ending virus.
For the latest, let's bring in White House correspondent James Rosen live on the North Lawn. Hi, James.
Bob and Katrina, good afternoon to you. As we cross this grim milestone of the 1 millionth death from COVID-19 here in the United States, it's well to ask ourselves, how did we get here? It was back on March 11, 2020, when the World Health Organization declared for the first time that a global pandemic was underway. And since then, we've seen about that. At that time, we should note that only 36 people had died here in the United States. It was by January of 2021 that we had eclipsed the total number of U.S. casualties suffered in World War II. According to a timeline published by Reuters, by early 2021, the virus had already claimed 500,000 lives, roughly half of today's total. So roughly half of the total death count took place under the Trump administration, the other half since the Biden administration came into office. It's also interesting to note that the first vaccination was rolled out in December 2020. So this suggests, this data, that again, half the COVID deaths have occurred since the introduction of the vaccine program. Leading scientists and the Biden administration will tell you that that strange fact owes more to vaccine resistance than it does to vaccine efficacy. President Biden issued a statement earlier this morning. It was markedly shorter and less detailed than the one he released in February for the 900,000th COVID death here in the United States. As a nation, Mr. Biden said this morning, we must not grow numb to such sorrow. To heal, we must remember. We must remain vigilant against this pandemic and do everything we can to save as many lives as possible, as we have with more testing, vaccines, and treatments than ever before. And then adding a little promotion in favor of COVID funding that the White House has been seeking, the president added, it's critical that Congress sustain these resources in the coming months. Now, one thing that we are no closer to knowing as we cross the million death mark here, this grim milestone, is the origin of the coronavirus. There have been some suspicions focused on the Wuhan Institute of Virology as possibly the source of a lab leak accident that might have given rise to the outbreak. Others, including China and the World Health Organization, have pointed to an animal or zoonotic transmission of the virus to the first human patient. It was back in 2021 when President Biden ordered the U.S. intelligence community to spend 90 days re-reviewing all of the evidence. And in August of last year, the U.S. intelligence agency community announced that the agencies were split, some believing the zoonotic theory, some believing the lab leak theory. And as we cross this milestone today, by the official pronouncements of the United States government, we're no closer to knowing, and therefore woefully unprepared for the next pandemic, because we can't say what caused this one, Bob and Katrina.
Joining us right now to discuss the latest numbers we got this morning on the Producer Price Index, which was up 11% over last year at this time. And also this follows up on yesterday's Consumer Price Index, which was up 8.3% over last year's numbers. The former chief economist for the International Trade Commission, Peter Morici. Peter, how should we read these numbers?
Well, I think we should read these numbers that inflation persists, that it is the largest inflationary problem we've had since the Arab oil embargoes of the 1970s, and that the Fed needs to take very decisive action. And the Biden administration, except to the extent necessitated by the war in Ukraine, needs to exercise considerable restraint on how much money it spends. Neither of those is happening. So I expect that inflation at 2% is something that we will have to wait until we have another president.
Wow. We've also been hearing a lot about transitory inflation, that inflation is because of the pandemic or because of shipping issues. But does this pretty much say, okay, that whole transitory inflation blame game really is not remotely what is really happening here?
Well, the pandemic and it certainly caused everything to start happening. The war in the Ukraine was another crisis on top of it. What we really don't know, given how long both have now persisted, is how we come out. This is very much like when we went into the Korean War, when we went into World War II. The inflation that we got in those circumstances and the impact on what we make and how we make things was so profound that the economy was elementary changed when we finally came through it. Now, we have to say that the war in the Ukraine is not ending. We're moving to a stalemate. So the disruptions in the supply chain owing to the embargoes and the shifts in shipping that are required have not changed. China is really in the middle of the pandemic, whereas we're on the downside of the curve because they have delayed through their shutdowns, developing herd immunity. So we really don't know what's going to happen with China. So the answer is, these are largely non-economic events that are beyond the control of economists. And when they give you these sage forecasts that inflation, I just got one from Wells Fargo, it's going to be 2% by the end of 2023. That's like me calling the Super Bowl for 2027.
Yeah. By the way, the price of the national average of gas at the pump is $4.42. I believe that's either close or another record. And then we've seen, all you have to do is look at some of the pictures there or talk to people in California, and it's over that. And then diesel's higher than that by like $1.50. And we've seen the president call this Putin's price hike. How do you respond to that when you hear that?
Well, certainly the war and having to cut off oil imports from Russia and Europe and elsewhere in the world had an effect. But also the president continues to make war on the domestic oil industry and treats them in such a fashion. For example, he needs them to increase production, right? So when he makes his inflation message a few days ago from the White House, he attacks them. We're not going to give them a free ride, kind of language. So in that kind of environment, people aren't going to make the kinds of investments that are necessary to bring a lot more oil into the system and to bring gasoline prices down. The president of the United States really should be calling this the Putin-Biden inflation, or the Putin-Biden-Powell, inflation. But to blame it all on poor Vladimir Putin, as Teddy Roosevelt used to say about his dog Fala, we're just not smart enough to do all this.
Poor Putin. I haven't heard that term before. So, but Putin-Powell. I like the Putin-Powell thing. Peter, thank you.
You cannot blame every single problem in the universe on Vladimir
Exactly.
Putin. Yeah,
politicians, they tend to blame other people, even when they're responsible. So thank you very much, Peter Marisi. Thanks.
Thank you.